The phone rang at 11 at night, and Elena Marsh almost did not answer it. She was sitting alone in her wheelchair by the window of her penthouse, staring at the city lights, when her assistant Grace called with a question that made her stomach twist. "Should I send out the invitations for your birthday party this year?" Elena closed her eyes. "No, cancel it. Don't send anything. But last year over 200 people came. Your team loves you." "They came because I signed their paychecks, Grace, not because they wanted to be there." Elena's voice was flat, tired, final. "I don't want a party where people show up out of guilt." She ended the call before Grace could argue. The room felt heavy and silent, the way it had felt every night since the accident that took the use of her legs 2 years ago. Back then, she ran board meetings standing at the head of a long table, walking the floor of her own warehouses, shaking hands with drivers and clerks by name. Now she ran the same empire from a chair, giving orders through a screen, watching people's eyes drop the moment they noticed the wheels beneath her. It was not the pain in her body that hurt the most. It was the quiet, the slow fading of people who once filled her calendar with lunches and calls and plans. One by one, they had stopped asking her to dinner. One by one, they had stopped visiting. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she preferred it this way, safer, simpler, no one close enough to pity her. But some nights, like tonight, the truth pressed against her chest until it was hard to breathe. Her birthday was in 11 days, and for the first time since she was a child, she was certain that if she opened the door and waited, no one would walk through it. The next morning, a mix-up in the shipping department sent a young courier named Daniel Reyes to her building instead of the office downtown. He was new, only 3 weeks into the job, working the night shift in the warehouse so he could pick up his daughter from school every afternoon. He was a single father, and his daughter, Mia, was 6 years old and full of questions about everything, including why her father sometimes came home smelling like cardboard and diesel. Daniel had no idea the woman he was delivering documents to was the CEO of the entire company, until the elevator doors opened and he saw the nameplate on the office door. He almost turned around out of nerves, but he had a job to do, so he knocked. Elena answered the door herself, moving her chair back to let him in, expecting the usual reaction, the pause, the awkward smile, the eyes that did not know where to look. Daniel did none of that. He walked in, held out the folder and said, "These need a signature on page 3 and page 7. I can wait if you want to read it first." That was all. No comment about her chair, no soft voice like she was made of glass. Just a man doing his job, treating her like any other person he had to deliver papers to that day. Elena took the folder slower than she needed to, studying him. He was maybe 35, with tired eyes and a kind, plain face, the kind of face that looked like it had done a lot of worrying but had not let the worry win. She signed the pages without really reading them. "You're new," she said. 3 weeks, Daniel answered. "Warehouse floor, night shift." "Why night shift?" "My daughter. I need mornings and afternoons for her." He said it simply, without asking for sympathy, just stating a fact of his life, the way someone might mention the weather. Elena handed the folder back. "That's a hard schedule." "It works," Daniel said. "Most days." He left without lingering, without staring, without making her feel like an exhibit in her own home. And after the door closed, Elena sat there for a long moment, strangely unsettled. It had been so long since someone spoke to her like she was simply a person, and not a problem to be handled carefully. She told herself it meant nothing, a courier delivering papers, a mix-up in scheduling, nothing more. But 3 days later, when another document needed a signature, she found herself hoping the same young man would be the one to bring it. Elena had built her company from almost nothing. She started with one small delivery van and a phone line in a rented room above a bakery, back when she was 24 and had nothing to lose. She worked 18-hour days, drove the routes herself when a driver called in sick, and learned every part of the business from the ground floor up. By the time she turned 40, her company had grown into one of the largest logistics networks on the coast, moving goods through hundreds of warehouses and thousands of trucks. She was known for walking the floor, learning names, remembering birthdays of employees she had never formally met. People used to say that Elena Marsh never forgot a face. Then came the accident. A driver ran a red light on a rainy evening while she was crossing the street after a late meeting. The impact broke her spine in 2 places. She woke up in a hospital bed 3 days later to learn she would never walk again. The doctors were careful with their words, but the meaning was clear, and Elena absorbed it the way she absorbed every hard fact in her life, quietly, without complaint, filing it away as something to manage rather than something to feel. The first year after the accident, people rallied around her. Flowers filled her hospital room. Cards arrived by the dozens. Executives visited with gifts and promises to help however they could. But grief and pity do not last forever, and slowly, the visits grew shorter, then less frequent, then stopped altogether. Meetings that once happened in person moved to video calls. Lunches were replaced with emails. Elena noticed, though she never said anything. She told herself it was simply how the world worked. People were busy. Life moved on. She adjusted her expectations to match the silence, and in doing so, she built a wall so quiet and so steady that even she stopped noticing it was there. Her assistant Grace was the only person who still came by in person most days, and even Grace had begun to sense that Elena preferred distance over closeness now. Grace tried, gently, to include her in things. An invitation to a co-worker's baby shower, a company picnic, a holiday dinner. Elena declined almost every time, always with a polite excuse, always with a reason that sounded reasonable on its own, but added up to a pattern of retreat. The birthday party had once been the one exception. Every year, without fail, Elena hosted a small gathering at the office. Simple food, quiet music, a chance to thank the people who kept the company running. It had never been about grandeur. It was about connection. A night where she remembered why she built the company in the first place. Last year, even in a wheelchair, even exhausted from months of physical therapy, she had hosted it anyway, and the room had been full. This year felt different. This year, something in her had quietly given up on the idea that people would come without an incentive tied to her title. She could not explain when that belief had settled in, only that it had, slow and heavy, until it felt like fact rather than fear. Daniel Reyes knew none of this history when he knocked on her door that first day. He only knew that a woman in a wheelchair needed papers signed, and that he had a job to do before his shift ended, and he could pick up Mia from her after-school program. His life, in its own way, was just as full of quiet struggle as Elena's, though he rarely thought of it in those terms. His wife had passed 3 years earlier, an illness that took her quickly, leaving him with a toddler and a mountain of bills and a grief he had learned to carry without letting it show. He worked nights so his days could belong to his daughter. He cooked breakfast every morning before dropping her at school, picked her up every afternoon, helped with homework at the kitchen table, and then, once she was asleep, drove to the warehouse to load and unload trucks until the sun came up. He did not think of himself as someone with a hard story. He thought of himself as a father doing what fathers do. It was this quiet, unassuming steadiness that made him different from the people who usually surrounded Elena, people who often measured their words around her carefully, unsure how to act, uncertain whether kindness or silence was the safer choice. When Daniel returned 3 days later with another folder of documents, Elena was already waiting near the door, though she would not have admitted that to anyone. She opened it before he could knock. "Page 4 and page 9 this time," he said, holding out the folder with the same plain, easy manner as before. "You remembered," Elena said. "I read the note Grace sent. Didn't want to waste your time flipping through it." She almost smiled. It had been a long time since someone had done something so small and thoughtful without turning it into a performance of kindness. She signed the pages, and this time, she did not rush him out the door. "How old is your daughter?" she asked. 6. Going on 20, some days. Daniel allowed himself a short laugh. "She asks more questions in an hour than most adults ask in a week." "What kind of questions?" "Why the sky doesn't fall, why dogs can't talk, why some people get sad and don't tell anyone." He paused, as if surprised he had said that last one out loud. "She's observant. Comes from watching me too closely, probably." Elena studied him for a moment. There was no self-pity in the way he spoke, only honesty, plain and unguarded. It was rare enough that she noticed how rare it was. "You handle a lot alone," she said. Everyone handles something alone, Daniel replied. Some of it just shows more than others. He said it without any particular weight, but the words landed on Elena harder than he could have known. She thought of her own silence, the calls she stopped returning, the invitations she stopped sending, all of it dressed up as independence when it was really something closer to fear. She did not respond right away, and Daniel, sensing he had said enough for one visit, gathered the signed papers and thanked her for her time before heading back down to the warehouse floor. That night, for the first time in months, Elena did not immediately reach for her laptop to bury herself in reports. She sat by the window instead, thinking about a man she had spoken to twice, a man who carried more than she initially realized, yet moved through his days without asking anyone to notice. She thought about her own birthday, 11 days away, and the empty calendar Grace had asked about. She thought about the wall she had built, brick by brick, without ever meaning to build it at all. She did not know it yet, but the conversation that would change the direction of that birthday, and perhaps far more than that, was still to come. Grace noticed the change before Elena did. It was a small thing at first, the way Elena asked, almost too casually, whether the warehouse deliveries would be handled by the same courier as before. Grace had worked for Elena long enough to know that her employer rarely asked about staff members by function rather than by name, and she rarely asked twice. "Do you mean Daniel?" Grace asked, glancing up from her tablet. "I don't know his last name," Elena said, though of course she did. She had read it off his uniform badge both times he visited. "Reyes. Daniel Reyes. Good worker, from what I hear. Quiet, reliable, never late." Grace hesitated, then added, "Why do you ask?" "No reason," Elena said, turning back to her monitor, though the question stayed with her long after Grace left the room. Over the following days, Elena found herself paying attention to details she normally ignored: the schedule of warehouse deliveries, the names on shift rosters, the small conversations she overheard through video calls with department heads. She told herself it was simple curiosity, the same instinct that once made her learn the names of every driver on her payroll. But some nights, lying awake with the city lights glowing faintly through her window, she admitted to herself that it was something more specific than curiosity. It was the memory of a man who had looked at her without flinching, who had spoken to her without softening his voice into something delicate and careful, who had treated her, for just a few minutes each visit, like an equal rather than a fragile thing to be managed. On the following Thursday, another set of documents needed a signature, this time related to a shipment delay at one of the regional hubs. Grace offered to send someone from the main office, but Elena said it was fine to let the warehouse floor handle it, since the delay involved warehouse operations directly. It was a reasonable explanation. It also happened to guarantee that Daniel would be the one to bring the papers. When he arrived that afternoon, Elena had already prepared 2 cups of tea, an unusual gesture for her, one she had not made for a visitor in longer than she cared to admit. Daniel noticed but said nothing beyond a simple thank you when she offered him a cup. "Rough week?" Elena asked, gesturing to the tired lines around his eyes. "Mia had a fever over the weekend, kept me up most nights." Daniel took a sip of the tea, clearly grateful for it. "She's better now, thankfully. Kids bounce back fast." "Do you have help? Family nearby?" "Not really. My parents are back east, too far to come quickly if something happens. It's mostly just me and her." He said it plainly, without inviting sympathy, the same steady tone he always used when speaking about his life. "That sounds exhausting," Elena said. "It is, some days, but she's worth it, every bit of it." He smiled, the kind of smile that came from somewhere deep and real, not performed for anyone's benefit. "I used to think I couldn't do it alone. Turns out you can do a lot more than you think, once you have to." Elena turned her cup slowly in her hands. "I used to think that too, that I could do everything alone if I had to." "And now?" The question caught her off guard, simple as it was. She had not expected him to ask anything back, had not expected the conversation to turn toward her own life so directly. For a moment she considered deflecting, turning the topic back to business, the way she did with almost everyone who came close to asking something personal. But something about Daniel's calm, unhurried patience made the deflection feel unnecessary, even foolish. "Now I'm not so sure anymore," she said quietly. Daniel did not push further. He simply nodded, as if her honesty was enough, as if he understood that some truths needed space rather than questions. They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, the kind of silence that did not need filling. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said eventually. "Go ahead. Grace mentioned your birthday is coming up soon. Is there a celebration planned?" Elena felt her chest tighten instinctively, the old defense rising before she could stop it. "No, I decided not to do one this year." Any particular reason? She could have given him the same polished excuse she gave Grace, something about being too busy, about not wanting a fuss. But the words that came out instead were more honest than she intended. "I don't think people would come," she said. "Not really. Not for me. Maybe out of obligation, but not because they wanted to." Daniel set his cup down carefully on the small table beside him. "Can I tell you something? It might sound strange coming from someone you've only just met." "Go ahead," Elena said again, curious despite herself. "After my wife passed, I went through a long stretch where I believed something similar, that people only reached out because they felt they had to, that the sympathy would run out eventually, and once it did, I'd be alone with it. So I stopped reaching back, stopped answering calls the way I used to, stopped going to things I was invited to, telling myself I was protecting myself from disappointment." "What changed?" Elena asked. "Mia," Daniel said simply. She was too young to understand grief the way adults do, but she understood loneliness. One night she asked me why we never saw anyone anymore, why our house used to be full of people and now it wasn't. I didn't have a good answer for her. I realized I had built the very isolation I was afraid of, all on my own, brick by brick, without anyone forcing me to do it. Elena felt something tighten in her throat, a recognition too close for comfort. "So I started small," Daniel continued. "I called an old friend, just to talk. I said yes to one invitation I would have normally declined, and most of the time people showed up. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. I think the truth is, people show up more often than we expect. We're just too afraid to test it, so we assume the worst and save ourselves the risk of finding out we were wrong." The room was quiet after he finished speaking. Elena stared at her tea, now lukewarm in her hands, turning his words over slowly, feeling them settle into places she had not expected them to reach. "That's a generous way to see the world," she finally said. "It's not always easy to believe," Daniel admitted. "Some days I still doubt it, but I'd rather risk being wrong about people showing up than spend my life certain they won't and never find out otherwise." He glanced at his watch and stood, gathering the folder of signed papers. "I should get back before my shift starts. But for what it's worth, I don't think you should assume no one will come. I think you should ask, and then let people surprise you." After he left, Elena sat by the window for a long while, the city stretching out below her in its usual glittering silence. She thought about the wall she had built over 2 years, thought about every excuse she had given herself for staying behind it, thought about how easily she had convinced herself that isolation was simply the natural outcome of her circumstances, rather than something she had quietly chosen, day after day, invitation after invitation. She thought about her birthday, now just over a week away, and the empty calendar Grace had asked about. She thought about the risk Daniel described, the discomfort of asking and possibly hearing silence in return. For the first time since the accident, she considered the possibility that the emptiness she feared was not a certainty at all, but simply a story she had been telling herself for so long that she had stopped questioning whether it was true. That night, she opened her laptop, pulled up her contact list, and stared at it for a long time before closing it again without sending anything. It was not courage yet, but it was the first crack in a wall that had stood untouched for 2 years. And cracks, however small, have a way of growing once the light finds its way through them. For 3 days after that conversation, Elena went about her work as usual, chairing calls with regional managers, reviewing quarterly numbers, approving shipments that moved across the country in a steady, invisible rhythm most people never thought about. But underneath the routine, something had shifted. She caught herself thinking about Daniel's words at odd moments, while reviewing spreadsheets, while staring out the window during a pause in a meeting, while lying awake long after the city outside had gone quiet. The idea of sending invitations sat in her mind like a small stone she could not stop turning over, Every time she almost reached for her laptop to draft a simple message, doubt crept in and stopped her hand. She imagined the invitations going out, and the silence that might follow. She imagined polite refusals, or worse, no response at all, just a quiet confirmation of everything she already believed about herself. Grace, sensing something had changed but not entirely sure what, tried gently probing over lunch one afternoon. "You've been different this week," she said, setting down a tray of food on the small table by Elena's desk. "Something on your mind?" "I've been thinking about the birthday," Elena admitted, surprising herself with how easily the words came out. Grace's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Does that mean you're reconsidering?" "Maybe," Elena said. "I don't know yet." "For what it's worth," Grace said carefully, "I think people would come. I think they'd want to. You've done more for this company and the people in it than you probably realize, especially these last 2 years." Elena managed a small, doubtful smile. "You have to say that. You work for me." "I say a lot of things because I work for you," Grace replied, matching her tone. "But that's not one of them." The conversation stayed with Elena longer than she expected. That evening, after Grace left for the day, Elena found herself staring at the same blank message window on her laptop, the cursor blinking patiently, waiting for words that refused to come easily. She thought of Daniel again, of the plain honesty in his voice when he talked about testing the fear of being alone, rather than assuming the worst without ever finding out. She began to type, slowly at first, deleting sentences that sounded too formal, too much like a corporate announcement rather than an invitation from one person to others. After several attempts, she settled on something simple. "I would like to invite you to a small gathering for my birthday next week. Nothing formal, just good food and good company, if you are able to come. No obligation, only an open door if you would like to walk through it." She read it over several times, hesitating before finally sending it to a modest list of names, current employees she had once known well, former colleagues who had drifted out of touch, a few old friends from the early years of building the company. It was a smaller list than in years past, chosen carefully, people she genuinely hoped would come, rather than people she felt obligated to invite. Once the messages were sent, she closed the laptop and sat in the quiet of her apartment, feeling a strange mixture of relief and dread. The invitations were out. Now there was nothing to do but wait. And waiting, she realized, might be the hardest part of all. The following days passed slowly. A few replies came in quickly, brief and warm, confirming attendance without hesitation. Others took longer, and Elena found herself checking her messages more often than she cared to admit, each notification sending a small jolt of anticipation through her chest. Some people did not respond at all, and each unanswered message felt like a quiet confirmation of her old fears, even as the confirmed replies slowly built a modest but real list of names. Meanwhile, without Elena's knowledge, Daniel had been quietly doing something of his own. During his shifts at the warehouse, he mentioned the invitation to a few coworkers who had received it, but seemed uncertain about attending. Some worried it would be awkward, others assuming a room full of executives would leave little space for warehouse staff to feel welcome. "She's not like that," Daniel told one coworker during a break, leaning against a stack of pallets while eating a quick sandwich. "She remembers people. She used to know everyone's name on this floor before the accident. I think she's just afraid no one will show up, the same way any of us would be." "You really think she wants us there, not just as a formality?" the coworker asked. "I think she needs to know people want to be there," Daniel said. "There's a difference between an invitation people feel forced to accept and one they actually choose to walk into. I'd like to help make sure it's the second one." Word spread slowly through the warehouse floor and the main office alike, quiet conversations here and there, coworkers reminding each other of small kindnesses Elena had shown them over the years before her accident, memories of birthdays she had personally acknowledged, promotions she had championed, tough moments she had helped people through without ever making a show of it. The invitation, once seen by some as an awkward formality, slowly began to look like a chance to give something back to a woman who had given quietly for years without expecting recognition in return. Elena knew none of this was happening. She only saw the replies trickling in on her screen, unaware of the conversations unfolding in break rooms and warehouse aisles. unaware that a wider circle of people had begun quietly deciding, on their own, that they wanted to be there. 4 days before the event, Daniel returned to Elena's penthouse with a final set of documents, the last delivery scheduled before the shift rotation changed for the following month. Elena greeted him at the door, immediately noticing something different in his expression, a quiet excitement he seemed to be holding back. "Everything all right?" she asked, gesturing him inside. "Everything's fine," Daniel said, setting the folder down on the table. "I heard you sent out invitations." Elena felt a small flush of embarrassment, unsure how word had already reached him. "I did. I don't know how it will go, but I decided to try." "That took courage," Daniel said, and he meant it plainly, without exaggeration. "It felt more like fear, honestly," Elena admitted. "I keep waiting for people to quietly decline, or worse, just not respond at all. How many have responded so far?" "A good number, actually. More than I expected." She hesitated, then added, "But I still worry the ones who said yes are only being polite." Daniel sat down across from her, his expression thoughtful. "Can I tell you something else? Something I probably should have mentioned earlier." "Go ahead." "People talk more than you realize, especially on the warehouse floor. Word about the invitation spread fast. And from what I've heard, a lot of people are genuinely excited, not because they feel obligated, but because they remember things you did for them, things you probably don't even think about anymore, because they were small to you but big to them." Elena felt something tighten in her chest, an emotion she could not immediately name. "What kind of things?" "Someone mentioned you personally approved emergency leave for a family situation, without making them go through weeks of paperwork. Someone else said you remembered their child's name months after meeting them once at a company event. Small things maybe to you, not small to them." Elena sat quietly for a moment, absorbing this. She had done those things without expecting anything in return, without keeping track of them as acts of kindness worth remembering. It had simply been the way she operated, back when she still believed her presence mattered to people beyond her title. "I didn't know any of that stayed with people," she said softly. "That's usually how it works," Daniel replied. "The things that matter most to others are often the things we forget we even did." They sat together for a while longer, the conversation drifting into easier topics. Mia's latest questions about the world, a funny mishap on the warehouse floor earlier that week, small pieces of ordinary life that felt, in their own quiet way, like the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find. Before Daniel left, he paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I'll be there too, if that's all right." Elena felt a small, unfamiliar warmth rise in her chest. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that very much." After he left, Elena sat by the window once more, watching the last light of evening fade over the city. The birthday was only 4 days away now, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something closer to hope than dread settling into the space where fear used to live. The days leading up to the birthday moved both too slowly and too quickly for Elena, an odd contradiction she could not quite explain even to herself. Every morning she woke with a small flicker of anticipation, and by evening, that flicker had usually curdled into a familiar knot of worry. She checked her guest list obsessively, counting confirmations, recounting them, wondering how many of the people who said yes would actually walk through the door when the day came. Grace noticed the shift in her employer's mood immediately, and did her best to keep things calm and organized. "The caterer is confirmed," she told Elena, 2 days before the event, going over a checklist on her tablet. "Simple menu, just like you asked. Nothing overly formal. The main hall on the 3rd floor is being arranged now, and the sound system will play soft background music. Nothing distracting." "And the guest count?" Elena asked, though she already knew the number from checking it herself the night before. 43 confirmed so far, Grace said. A few more likely to respond before the day itself. 43. It was fewer than the crowds of the past, but to Elena, it felt both reassuring and terrifying at once. 43 people who had chosen, without obligation forcing their hand, to show up. And yet, the fear lingered stubbornly beneath the surface, whispering that confirmations could be canceled, that good intentions could fade once the actual day arrived, that people often said yes, out of politeness, long before they truly meant it. That evening, alone in her apartment, Elena found herself staring at old photographs stored in a drawer she rarely opened. Pictures from years past, birthdays celebrated in the office before the accident, group photos filled with laughing faces, employees she remembered by name even now, memories she had quietly locked away, rather than confront the ache of comparing them to her current isolation. She held one photograph for a long time, a picture from 5 years earlier, herself standing at the center of a crowded room, unaware that such moments would ever feel uncertain again. She thought about calling Daniel just to hear his steady, grounded voice, but stopped herself, unsure whether it would seem strange to lean on someone she had only recently come to know. Instead, she sat with her own thoughts, turning over the fear that had settled into her chest, trying to separate what was real from what was simply old habit dressed up as certainty. The following morning, a small complication arose that threatened to unravel her fragile confidence entirely. Grace arrived with an apologetic expression, informing Elena that 3 of the confirmed guests, all longtime employees she had specifically hoped would attend, had just canceled due to a scheduling conflict at a regional office that required their urgent attention. "I'm sorry," Grace said, watching Elena's face carefully. "I know you were looking forward to seeing them." Elena felt the old fear rise sharply, sudden and sharp, confirming every doubt she had tried to push away over the past week. It did not matter that the excuse was reasonable, that emergencies happened, that cancellations were a normal part of any planned gathering. In her mind, it felt like proof, undeniable and immediate, that the wall she had built for 2 years had been right about people all along. "Maybe I should cancel the whole thing," she said quietly, almost to herself. Maybe this was a mistake. Grace crouched slightly beside her chair, her voice gentle but firm. 3 people out of 43 is not everyone, Elena. It's not even close to everyone. You can't let 3 cancellations erase the fact that 40 other people are still planning to come. Elena did not answer right away, torn between the fear whispering its familiar warnings and the small, stubborn hope that had been growing quietly over the past week. Later that afternoon, Daniel arrived unexpectedly, not for a delivery this time, but simply to check in, having heard through casual conversation with Grace that something had unsettled Elena earlier in the day. He found her sitting near the window, her expression distant and troubled. "Grace mentioned a rough morning," Daniel said gently, taking a seat nearby without waiting for an invitation, a familiarity that had grown naturally between them over the past weeks. 3 cancellations, Elena said. "I know it shouldn't matter this much, but it feels like proof of everything I was afraid of." Daniel considered this for a moment before responding. "Can I ask you something? When you built this company, starting with 1 delivery van and nothing else, did every single plan work out exactly as you hoped?" Elena almost laughed despite herself. "No, not even close. I lost contracts, lost drivers, lost entire routes to competitors, more times than I can count. And did that mean the company was doomed to fail? That nothing was worth building?" "No," she admitted. "It meant some things worked and some things didn't, and I kept building anyway." "This isn't so different," Daniel said. 3 people couldn't make it. That doesn't erase the 40 who are choosing to be there. It just means this particular gathering, like everything worth doing, comes with some uncertainty built into it. That's not proof of failure. That's just what happens when you let people back into your life instead of keeping them locked outside it." Elena turned his words over slowly, feeling the sharp edge of her earlier fear begin to soften, if only slightly. "You always seem to know exactly what to say." "Not always," Daniel admitted, a small, honest smile crossing his face. "Most days I'm just as unsure as anyone else, but I've learned that assuming the worst rarely protects you from anything. It usually just guarantees you feel the pain of loneliness twice, once in the fear, and once again if it actually happens." They sat together for a while, the conversation drifting into quieter, easier territory. Small stories about Mia's latest adventures at school, a funny anecdote from the warehouse floor, ordinary moments that had slowly become a source of comfort for Elena in a life that had felt, for so long, stripped of exactly that kind of comfort. Before he left, Daniel paused at the door once more. "Tomorrow's the day. Try to remember that the people walking through that door will be there, because they want to be, not because they have to be. And even if it's a smaller room than it used to be, it's still a room full of people who chose you. That night, Elena barely slept, her mind cycling between hope and worry in equal measure. She thought about the empty calendar she had almost accepted as permanent only 2 weeks earlier. Thought about the invitation she had sent with trembling uncertainty. Thought about the quiet courage it had taken to ask people to show up rather than assuming, safely and painfully, that they never would. As the first light of morning crept through her window, marking the arrival of the day she had both anticipated and dreaded in equal measure, Elena felt something settle inside her. Not the absence of fear entirely, but a quiet willingness to face it anyway, to walk into the uncertainty of the day ahead, with an openness she had not allowed herself in longer than she could remember. Whatever the day held, she had done the hardest part already. She had asked. Now, all that remained was to see who would answer. The morning of her birthday arrived with a soft, golden light that spilled across the city, in a way Elena might have found beautiful on any other day. Instead, she spent the early hours in a quiet, anxious haze, going over small details that hardly needed her attention, checking the seating arrangement Grace had already confirmed twice, reviewing the caterer's menu, though it had not changed since the day before. Anything to keep her mind occupied and away from the fear still lingering beneath the surface. By early afternoon, she found herself in the main hall on the 3rd floor, wheeled in ahead of the guests to inspect the space one final time. The room had been arranged simply, just as she requested, round tables scattered with modest centerpieces, a small stage for background music, warm lighting that softened the wide open space into something inviting rather than formal. It looked, she thought, exactly like the kind of gathering she used to host years ago, back when she still trusted that people wanted to be near her. "It looks good," Grace said, standing beside her, offering a reassuring smile. "Everything's ready." "Now we just wait," Elena said, her voice quieter than she intended. The first guests began arriving a little after 5 in the evening, trickling in slowly at first. Familiar faces from departments across the company, people she had worked alongside for years before the accident had quietly separated her from most of them. A woman named Priya, who managed the accounting department, arrived early with a warm hug that caught Elena off guard, murmuring how glad she was to finally see her again outside of video calls. A man named Oliver, one of the original drivers from the earliest days of the company, arrived with an old photograph he had kept for years, a picture of Elena standing beside her very first delivery van, grinning with an exhaustion that could only come from genuine joy in building something from nothing. As the room slowly filled, Elena felt her fear ease with each new arrival, replaced gradually by a warmth she had not expected to feel again. There were no scattered no-shows haunting empty tables the way she had imagined during her sleepless night. Instead, small clusters of laughter grew steadily across the room, familiar voices catching up on years of missed time, co-workers reconnecting over shared memories that predated the isolation of the past 2 years. By 6 in the evening, the room held far more people than Elena had dared to expect, closer to 50 than the 43 confirmations Grace had last reported. Some brought unexpected guests. Others arrived simply because word had spread that Elena Marsh was finally opening her door again after 2 long years of quiet distance, and no one wanted to miss the chance to walk through it. One by one, people approached her throughout the evening, sharing small memories she had long forgotten, moments that had clearly meant more to them than she ever realized at the time. A young woman named Naomi, only recently promoted to a management position, thanked Elena for personally recommending her for the role years earlier, a decision Naomi credited with changing the entire direction of her career. An older man named Victor, nearing retirement after decades with the company, spoke quietly about how Elena had once quietly covered his hospital bills during a difficult year, never mentioning it again afterward, never expecting gratitude or recognition in return. Elena listened to each story with a growing lump in her throat, humbled by how much she had given without ever tracking it, without ever realizing how deeply those small acts of kindness had settled into other people's lives long after she had forgotten them herself. As the evening deepened, the door opened once more, and Daniel walked in, holding Mia's small hand as she peered curiously around the bright, lively room. He had mentioned earlier that week that he might not be able to find someone to watch Mia for the evening, and Elena had told him, without hesitation, that Mia was more than welcome to come along. Mia approached Elena's chair with the fearless curiosity only a 6-year-old could carry, studying the wheels with open interest, rather than the careful avoidance most adults displayed. "Does this go fast?" she asked, tilting her head. Elena laughed, a genuine, unguarded laugh that surprised even herself. "Not as fast as I'd like, but fast enough." "Daddy said you're the boss of a lot of trucks," Mia continued, undeterred. "That's true," Elena said. "A lot of trucks, and even more people, who make sure those trucks go where they need to." Mia considered this seriously, before holding out a small, slightly crumpled piece of paper. "I made you a birthday card. Daddy said you might not have a lot of people to give you cards, so I made an extra big one." Elena took the card carefully, unfolding it to find a crayon drawing of a bright yellow sun, a simple truck beneath it, and a wobbly but heartfelt message wishing her a happy birthday in a child's careful handwriting. Something in Elena's chest tightened, warm and overwhelming, threatening tears she had not expected to shed so openly in front of a room full of people. "Thank you," she said softly, meaning it more deeply than the simple words could express. "This might be my favorite gift tonight." Daniel watched the exchange with quiet warmth, waiting until Mia wandered off toward the dessert table before speaking. "I told you people would show up," he said simply. "You did," Elena admitted. "I still can't quite believe it, honestly. I spent so long convinced this room would stay empty." "It's easy to convince yourself of things when you never test them," Daniel said. "Harder to keep believing them once you do." Elena looked around the room, taking in the warm chaos of laughter and conversation, the genuine joy on faces she had once assumed only tolerated her out of obligation. She thought about the 2 years of quiet withdrawal, the walls she had built brick by brick, without ever noticing the isolation settling in around her, the slow, painful acceptance that emptiness was simply her new reality, rather than a story she had chosen to believe. "I almost canceled all of this," she admitted quietly, more than once. "I'm glad you didn't," Daniel said. "So am I," Elena replied, and for the first time since the accident, she meant those words completely, without the shadow of doubt that usually followed close behind. As the evening wound down, guests slowly began to leave, each offering warm goodbyes, promises to visit more often, invitations of their own that Elena found herself eager to accept rather than politely decline. Grace stayed until the very end, helping tidy the last details of the evening, glancing occasionally at Elena with a quiet, satisfied smile, clearly pleased to see her employer surrounded by genuine warmth rather than the careful distance that had defined so many recent years. Daniel and Mia were among the last to leave, Mia yawning sleepily against her father's shoulder as he gathered her jacket and small backpack. Before heading toward the door, Daniel turned back once more. "Same time next week for the paperwork?" he asked, a small knowing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'd like that," Elena said. "Actually, I'd like that even if there's no paperwork at all." Daniel's smile widened slightly. "I think that can be arranged." After they left, Elena remained in the quiet hall for a while longer, looking around at the gentle disarray of a room that had, only hours earlier, filled with more warmth and connection than she had allowed herself to imagine possible. She thought about the empty calendar she had almost accepted as permanent, the wall she had built out of fear rather than fact, the quiet courage it had taken to test a belief she had carried for 2 long years. She thought about Daniel's simple, steady words from weeks earlier, about how people show up more often than we expect, if only we're willing to risk finding out. She thought about small, forgotten kindnesses returning to her in the form of shared memories and warm embraces, proof that connection, once given freely, has a way of finding its way back when least expected. For the first time since the accident had taken so much from her, Elena felt something settle deeply and quietly within her chest, not the absence of every fear, but a steady, growing hope that the isolation she had feared was never truly permanent at all. It had only ever been a wall of her own making, and walls, she now understood, can always be taken down, one small, honest conversation at a time. As she wheeled slowly toward the elevator, the empty hall behind her no longer felt like proof of loneliness, but simply the quiet, peaceful aftermath of a room that had, for one evening, been completely and joyfully full.